She says all other global partners should take their responsibilities as well. So that's Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President there, giving some insights into the EU's priority ahead of this key G20 meeting.
Yeah, plenty of issues will be under discussion for world leaders there, and there have been some tensions inside the bloc in recent weeks, particularly between Germany and France. Will they be able to set these differences aside and perhaps present a united front?
It's entirely true that we've seen in Brussels over the last 2 weeks and across the continent some tests of unity, particularly when it comes to Paris and Berlin, France and Germany, which are often described as the engine of the European Union when it comes to driving forward the EU's goals and its progress. Now, what we've seen, for example, is some quite public rifts between the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron. We saw some meetings cancelled, for example. Now, as they head into this G20 meeting, those particular differences, which may now be heading towards some more of a sort of rapprochement, they would really be seen as something which are more of a danger to the EU's internal politics. So when it comes to, for example, getting sign-off on big internal EU policies, like whether or not to cap gas prices as the EU faces and is embroiled in an energy crisis. On more foreign policy issues, which will be, of course, at the top of the agenda at the G20, well, they're seen as having less of a difference. Of course, compared to that broad difference of opinion among the G20 overall, France and Germany are pretty much on the same page when it comes to these big foreign policy questions. But those rifts do appear to, for now, remain. We haven't seen any sort of public rapprochement, and they do spell some concerns for the EU moving forward, particularly when it comes to testing that unity which has, until now, more or less proved to be strong. I think most analysts would say, particularly in the face of very challenging times for this continent, as it faces an energy crisis, spiraling energy prices, but also, of course, as it faces all-out war on its doorstep. So France and Germany heading into the G20, both of their leaders there expected to make statements. They'll broadly be on the same page in the foreign policy issues, but of course those domestic tensions will be of concern still here in Brussels.
Well, Rosie Burchard joining us from Brussels. Thanks so much for that, Rosie. Chinese President Xi Jinping will be attending the G20 Summit. He arrived in Bali a couple of hours ago. Now, officials and businessmen from Indonesia have expressed their expectations for Chinese President Xi's visit to the country. Take a listen.
Most of the leaders of the G20 will come and participate at the summit in Bali. Of course, as Ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia in China, we are looking forward to the visit of President Xi Jinping. And then Bali is beautiful. So please do come, welcome to Indonesia and to Bali.
I think the Chinese has been a very strong partner of Indonesia, both in trade and investment, and we're hoping especially during this, of course this is a multilateral platform, but we are also taking the opportunity, the momentum to enhance our bilateral cooperation. The world now is facing unprecedented situation. It's important that in the recovery of together we are focusing on the collaboration aspect. The theme on the B20 is advancing innovation, inclusion and collaboration. So I think this is really three areas that's very important where the China can play a role.
Ahead of this year's G20 Summit, China Media Group spoke with Indonesian President Joko Widodo about his expectations for the leaders' meeting.
Indonesia hosts the rotating presidency of G20 this year, and very soon in November is going to host heads of states and government summit here in this beautiful island of Bali. So we just wonder, how's the preparation going and what issues would top the agenda?
Iya, G20 adalah grup negara-negara besar yang juga punya.
The G20 is a group of major world powers. It has enormous influence. We are together facing many problems now. The crisis must be overcome, and the global economy must recover as soon as possible. We must be well prepared. So the G20 Summit must produce concrete results, complete practical tasks, and have a real impact on the world. We should avoid empty talks and instead focus on cooperation to create a better future. The current financial crisis, energy crisis, and the food crisis are intertwined. And we should deal with them together, not alone. The G20 has the power to influence future development.
China and Indonesia's railway project is seeing positive progress. The 150-kilometer rail project is expected to ease challenges for commuters and completely modernize Indonesia's transportation industry. CGTN Sukina Aluwalia reports.
Indonesia is preparing to unveil Southeast Asia's first high-speed railway. The project is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It will connect Jakarta with West Java's most populated city, Bandung.
Most important project between Indonesia and China, and as the largest foreign investment in Indonesia history, this project is this strategic position. So this time the G20 meeting, Indonesia said is the chairman. We have to do the showcase about our project to show the cooperation between Indonesia and China, to show the faster development of Indonesia society.
The project is expected to accelerate both social and economic growth in the country. This project will completely transform Indonesia's transportation industry. Hundreds of people commute between Jakarta and Bandung each and every day. Usually it would take around 2.5 hours by car, but with this train it would take just around 45 minutes. A monumental progress for millions of people that have to brave Jakarta's traffic daily.
I think the development or the construction of the high-speed railway is not only to bring the benefit to the people, to the transportation sector, but also give the benefit to the, such example, for the Indonesian railway development, and then for the aspect of technology, and then also for the economic point of view. And this operation of the high-speed railway Jakarta-Bandung in next year, hopefully in next year, is the significant and important milestone for the development of the railways in Indonesia.
The high-speed train is targeted to start early operations in June 2023. Sulkina Aluwalia, CGTN, Bandung.
Today, our world, cultures, and societies are changing like never before. An era fraught with challenges, financial risks, food and energy crises, conflict. The world has once again reached a crossroads.
As global leaders gather in Bali, Indonesia for the G20 Summit, issues remain.
How can they find new solutions for global challenges?
How can they create new drivers for a global growth? Can we recover together and stronger?
Tune in to CGTN as we bring you live coverage from our reporters and in-depth analysis on options for a shared future.
Welcome back. You're now watching CGTN special coverage, Options for a Shared Future. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Bali to attend the G20 Leaders Summit. He is expected to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden, and G20 leaders will begin talks on Tuesday under the theme of Recover Together, Recover Stronger. For a closer look at the meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden and the G20 Summit, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Victor Gao, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, and Professor Teng Jianqun, researcher at the China Institute of International Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen, on our special program. Now, for the latest on the visit, let's bring in our reporters in Bali. We have Dong Xue at Mulia Hotel, where the meeting will be held, Chen Ziyuan at the Grand Hyatt, where President Biden will give a post-meeting press conference, and also Tang Bo at the Media Center. Great to have you, all of us, on our show. So let's start with you, Dong Xue. What do we know so far about the meeting from the Chinese side?
Well, Mama, yes, in this hour, Chinese President Xi Jinping has already arrived here in Bali, Indonesia, for the G20 Leaders Summit. Well, here at the hotel, which the highly anticipated Biden and Xi Jinping bilateral talks will be taking place. Journalists are gathering and waiting to expect the meeting to be happening soon. Well, according to Chinese Foreign Ministry, that China's policy and position on the United States is consistent and clear. And the spokesperson said, and I quote, that we are committed to working with the U.S. to achieve mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, while firmly safeguarding our own sovereignty and security and development interests. And the spokesperson also stressed that hopes that the U.S. side will work with China to appropriately keep differences in check, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, and avoid misunderstandings and misjudgments in order to push the bilateral U.S.-China relations back on track for healthy and stable development. Well, this will be the inaugural face-to-face summit since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out nearly 3 years ago, and the first face-to-face meeting since Biden became president, and also the first meeting between China and the United States after completing their respective major domestic political agendas. Well, and also it is the first meeting between the top leaders of China and the United States since Pelosi's controversial trip to Taiwan. And having said all that, few world leaders have spent as much one-on-one time with Xi Jinping as Biden has. Well, since Biden was a vice president of the United States, he was the person chosen to be the point person to establish a personal relationship with China's leader Xi Jinping, and these two had quite changed a lot exchanges before that as well. Well, here in Bali, the G20 Summit promises to recover together and recover stronger. Well, earlier I also spoke with Jeffrey Sachs, a well-renowned U.S. economist, and he said he hopes the two leaders will say, let's reduce the attention, let's reduce the soundbites, criticism. He also stressed to not read China as a great threat, and how U.S. unilateral actions like blocking the export of technology to China are unwise policy decisions. If Biden and Xi Jinping can muster the political will, according to Jeffrey Sachs, there is hope the two sides can really establish a high-level strategic dialogue on many key areas. Mama.
All right, thank you for that, Dongxuan. Now let's turn to Chen Ziyuan. Well, Ziyuan, you've been following the development very closely in the lead up to the G20 summit in Bali. So what are some of the expectations from the U.S. side?
We just missed a bit, but I'm currently in front at the front entrance of the Grand Hyatt. So the motorcade of U.S. President Joe Biden just passed behind me. So we know that he's en route. Heavy presence of police and also security yelling at us, do not move at that point. And we are the only media pretty much on site. So what I want to share with you that this will be the venue hosting Biden's press conference after the bilateral meeting. And I want to share with you that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan actually briefed the media en route to Bali on the 13th that U.S. is prepared for stiff competition with China, and you pretty much get a sense of what's that mean and what kind of attitude they're bringing to the table. But he adds that U.S. do not seek conflict nor any confrontation. So what we are seeing here today here at the Grand Hyatt is pretty quiet, but you can see police cars moving in and out here with signs showing U.S. delegation as well as the flag. What I want to share with you that we also see some motorcade passing by us, including South Korea as well as Mexico just passed us. What I want to share with you is that on the ground, what we are seeing is, including reports from BBC as well as the Washington Post, that Biden is really want to play in the backyard of China. What I'm saying here is quoting what BBC has reporting on, is because it actually shows a sign that Biden is the first U.S. president attending ASEAN since 2017 as a U.S. president, and he flew right to Bali right after the meeting in ASEAN now, and he's here preparing for G20. So a lot of look out for. And what I want to add is that what we're seeing here on the ground is the many first time happening between China and U.S. This is the first time that the China and U.S. presidents meet after the pandemic, and also this is the first time that the both leaders are meeting after Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan, as well as
they have been through major political events happening at home. So a lot to look out for, and that's the latest situation here in front of Grand Hyatt. Back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you for that, Ziyuan. And now let's turn to Tang Bo. Well, Tang Bo, the world will be watching as leaders of the world's two biggest economies will meet. So what are some of the expectations there? You've been talking to experts and reporters covering this event. Bring us more.
Indeed, heads of states and government from the group of 20 major economies will meet in Bali this week, with some attending in person and others virtually. And President Xi Jinping has already arrived in Bali. He is here to attend the summit and hold a series of bilateral meetings with the foreign leaders, including U.S. President Joe Biden. The bilateral meetings marks the first face-to-face meeting between President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden since Mr. Biden took office. The meeting also comes after the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China and the contested midterms elections in the U.S. Local media Compass says the bilateral meeting is the spotlight of the whole summit, and the world is right now looking at the tropical island and the event. President Xi's visits comes at a time when the world needs greater momentum to recover from the economic slowdown due to COVID-19, as well as broader consensus to strengthen international cooperation to cope with the global challenges. Many experts say that President Xi Jinping will use his foreign visit to promote the vision of openness and cooperation, which was clearly defined at the 20th CPC National Congress in dealing with relations between China and the world. And the theme this year in Indonesia is Recover Together, Recover Stronger. It is important that world leaders put aside their differences, find new solutions to address global challenges, and create new drives for global growth. Back to you, Mama.
Thank you, Tang Bo, for bringing us the latest from Bali. Xi Jinping and Joe Biden have spoken 5 times by phone and video link since Biden became president last year. And their first phone talks took place on the eve of the Chinese New Year in February 2021, discussing issues that included Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. In September that year, their talks included climate change and the need for in-depth communication. While Biden said the two countries have no interest in letting competition veer into conflict, and U.S. side has no intention to change the One China policy. That was followed by a virtual meeting in November 2021. In March 2022, they discussed the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and Xi Jinping said they should keep differences under control. Biden said the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War and does not support Taiwan independence. And later on July 28th, Xi Jinping said that the two sides need to coordinate to keep global industrial and supply chains stable and protect global energy and food security. He also stressed that China's firm position on the Taiwan question. All right, now let's get some more discussion on this upcoming G20 summit and, of course, Xi Jinping's visit to Indonesia. I'm pleased to be joined here in the studio by my guests, Professor Victor Gao, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, and Mr. Teng Jianqun, researcher at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, great to have you both on our program. World leaders are now descending on Bali, plenty of archipelagos, 17,000 of them. But this time, they're talking some issues of very important, highly importance to the world. For example, economic recovery after the pandemic, how to control inflation, the war in Ukraine, and of course the relationship between China and the US. So, and this, as we mentioned a couple of times earlier, will be the first meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in their capacity as the presidents of both countries. What are your expectations, Professor Gao?
First of all, for the President Xi Jinping's summit meeting with President Biden of the United States, I think the whole world is holding its breath to see what exactly is going on, what will happen, what will be the highlights, and how the low roads can be avoided. Because this is a high-stake summit meeting, and both China and the United States want to do it right, because we want to control the expectation. And the best case scenario is that the two countries can decide to get along with each other amicably, for example, and work out on whatever differences they may have. But the low side, the low risk is that maybe, for example, the bilateral relations cannot be stabilized, and this will trigger huge consequences for world peace and development down the road. So let us give all the best wishes to President Xi Jinping of China and President Biden of the United States, and let's hope that they can really talk face to face and figure out a better way to manage China-US relations, not only for China and for the United States, but for mankind as a whole. For G20 Summit, I think it's very important. It's the first time in quite a few years for the global leaders to meet face to face, and face to face meetings like this is always very important because you have sideline meetings, you have private chats, for example, you have comparing of notes in private, in confidence, etc. And the world really is faced with tremendous amount of crisis, one crisis after another. You are talking about financial crisis, currency crisis, you are talking about inflation getting out of control, you are talking about global
Professor,
recession,
I'm afraid
etc.
we have to leave you there because we're going to get the latest from our reporter Dong Xue. She's covering the meeting, and we have the latest information is that Biden's motorcade is soon arriving at the venue of the meeting. Dong Xue, are you with us now? Yeah, bring us the latest there, Dong Xue.
Well, Mama, as you can probably see, the U.S. motorcade, the U.S. delegation, is gradually arriving here at the hotel. The highly anticipated Biden-Xi Jinping bilateral talks is about to happen anytime soon. As you know, our cameraman can pull in these shots below, There's already a lot of moves on the ground. Journalists and cameramen are all here stakeout for the Biden's arrival. And now, this is most highly anticipated bilateral talks between China and the U.S. Earlier Chinese Foreign Ministry has stressed that China's policy and position on the United States is consistent and clear. And the Chinese MOFA spokesperson has said, and I quote, "We're committed to working with the U.S. to achieve mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation while firmly safeguarding our own sovereignty, security, and development interests." The spokesperson also stressed that hopes that the U.S. side will work with China to appropriately keep differences in check, promote mutually beneficial cooperation, and to avoid misunderstanding. Well, there we are. The U.S. delegation motorcade is gradually entering the hotel, which we are expected to see Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Biden's bilateral talks to be started very soon. Well, this will be the first high-level bilateral talks since China has concluded its 20th CPC National Congress, and also after Biden has took his presidency probably around 2 years ago, and also this comes at after the controversial Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So there will be a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, whether these two head of states will use this opportunity to stabilize ties, or what kind of agreements or what kind of achievements will coming out of this bilateral ties. Okay.
All right, our reporter Dong Xue giving us the latest there at the venue where U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping are expected to meet, and that she was in very great proximity of that meeting. And now let's get the latest from our guests here in the studio. So we were analyzing the importance, the significance of this meeting. We are seeing that the U.S. delegation has arrived there at the venue, and Chinese delegation are expected to be there soon, marking a very important first face-to-face dialogue between the leaders of the two countries after the pandemic. I want to get your thoughts on this, Mr. Tong. This meeting comes right on the heels of the conclusion of the 20th Party Congress, and also the U.S. has had its midterm election, and Biden's party did fairly well in the midterm election, better than expected performance. So what is the significance of this meeting happening at this time?
Yeah, to be frank, I was a little bit surprised and excited at this time, because as a research fellow of American Studies, And we have witnessed the ups and downs or tensions between the two countries, at least in recent 5 years. So at this time, in terms of the relations between China and the United States, it's very important for the two leaders to chart the new roadmap for the two countries, because we are approaching such a crossroad, a very important crossroad. How can we maintain the stability between the two countries and chart a new roadmap for the future? This is actually good for the sake of the two countries. And in terms of the international community, of course, as two major powers in the world, I'm sure China and the United States will play a very important role in the recovery of the world economy and the recovery of the pandemic, COVID-19. So I think this is a very important summit for the two countries and also for the international community.
And certainly there's a great deal of complexity in the backdrop of this meeting, rising inflation, the pandemic, and also uncertainties in a lot of issues going on in the world. So what kind of message does this meeting send, Professor Gao, to the world that the two leaders are actually sitting down there and meet for the first time?
First of all, I would say in terms of China-US relations, probably it has never been as bad as it is today. However, the fact that the two leaders meet in Bali itself is a very good news. That means there is still channel of communication between the two leaders, between the two countries at the very top, and both sides want to do something to stabilize the relations. If we listen very carefully to what President Biden had to say, he is talking about all the right thing. And I just hope he will also do the right thing, talk the talk and walk the same walk, rather than talk one thing and do the other thing. On the Chinese side, I think President Xi Jinping has been very clear. China wants to have a constructive relations with the United States. China is not an enemy of the United States. China does not compete unconstructively with the United States. We are here and we want to cooperate with the United States. And mutual cooperation, better understanding between China and the United States will be better for the Chinese people as well as for the American people. And it will be great for the world, because this world cannot afford to have China and the United States getting at each other's jugular, and the United States promoting, for example, another Cold War, separating the United States and its allies from China, because that doesn't work. China is very much intertwined with the United States, and there is huge amount of people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. The more the leaders can talk and meet, the better. I personally hope there will be state visits by Biden to China and by the Chinese president to the United States in due course. Why not? These two countries are really very, very important. To get along with each other is better, absolutely better than confrontation between them. This should be the main message. China wants to get along with the United States.
Yeah, but as you mentioned just now, China and U.S. relations are now at a critical juncture. Can we expect any breakthrough in this meeting, Mr. Tang?
Yeah, I think number one job, I think the two sides should have a new consensus on the future of the relations between the two countries, because of the so-called competition strategy initiated by the former President Donald Trump. Actually, the recent 5 years, the two countries did have some obstacles in stabilizing relations between the two sides, including Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue, and some domestic topics like Xinjiang, like Hong Kong in China. So I think number one job for the two leaders at this time, they should have some more consensus, because any manipulation of the so-called issues related to the relation between the two countries should have new thinking. We cannot use or manipulate this dispute related to the two countries as a bargaining stake against each other. And the second, we should enhance the cooperation between the two countries because as two largest economies in the world, we should cooperate. No decoupling in any aspect, in any field, because this is the globalization of world economy we are facing now, and we should have cooperation in the development of our economy and not decoupling this time, because this is a very important moment for any country to think about. Actually, we are facing a possibility that a divided world, the United States would like to take a unilateral approach to establish some bloc in military and in economy to avoid or to prevent any cooperation from China. So this is really a challenge, a really obstacle for the two countries to think about how can the two countries go ahead together. This is really a large topic. So I'm sure the two leaders will touch upon such important topic in the summit, and of course we'll find a new consensus and the roadmap for the future of the two countries.
You mentioned decoupling, Mr. Tang. So was this something that was already taking shape, or do you see it as a perhaps distant possibility?
First of all, I think the U.S. initiated move towards decoupling itself is not only wrong, it's not constructive, and then it is not possible. Why? Because the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy are highly integrated with each other. And to decouple is destructive of both Chinese interests as well as American interests. So I hope U.S. decision makers will wake up to the reality and deal with China as it is and try to get away from this fallacy that they worry two things, actually. They worry about Chinese economy surpassing that of the United States in due course, and we believe it will happen within 10 years. And then they also worry that once China's economy is larger than the United States, China will want to be the next superpower in the world. This is completely untrue because from the Chinese perspective, we do not want to be another superpower. In Chinese philosophy, hegemon is a bad term. Hegemon is not something you actively pursue, for example. Hegemon is very bad in Chinese philosophy. And we do not want to impose our way of life, our political system onto any other country in the world, to say the least of the United States. We want to see that both countries can respect each other's system, we can get along with each other, and then no one really wants to impose my version of the truth onto anyone else. So I think there must be grounds for Biden and President Xi Jinping to really talk to each other, to better understand each other, and to realize the huge stakes involved for their summit in Bali, and hopefully they can emerge from the meeting with a better understanding of each other, and then China and the United States can be in a better position to get along with each other. That's my hope, and I hope this will be the vision for the world going forward.
That's your expectation, Professor Gao. But we know that in China-U.S. relations, we've seen trade war, we've seen the U.S.'s national security strategy, and we've seen the exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan, which is of course China's red line in its diplomacy. So tell us, can we expect the two leaders to perhaps cooperate to begin their talks in the more easier channels of communication, for example, climate change?
Yeah, this is actually a word of win-win cooperation. We should have such a mentality to cooperate in various areas, including trade. Actually, the trade between China and the United States has ranked at the third place in recent 3 or 4 years because of the trade war or trade conflict between the two sides. ASEAN has already become the #1 trade partner of China this time. So I think it's not a win-win cooperation to initiate a trade war between China and the United States, because a lot of complementarities between the two countries we can have to enhance the trade cooperation. And I don't think the trade war can make the United States, get something from such a competition. Actually, this is one part of the so-called strategic competition between China and the United States, initiated by the United States. So I think at this moment, the trade should be on the normal track, not a conflict, not a confrontation, not a war between the two sides, because of the complementarities between the two sides.
And we know that China and the U.S. reached several deals in their previous meetings, but some of the commitments are yet to be realized. Why is that, Professor Gao?
Well, I think from the Chinese perspective, the United States really is challenging some of the most important red line issues as far as China is concerned. And of the utmost importance is the Taiwan issue. You know, the United States has fully recognized China as the sovereign country and recognized that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China since January the 1st, 1979. However, in more recent years, the United States is really hollowing out this one China policy, and there are politicians in the United States who openly kind of deal with Taiwan not as a part of China, but as if it is a sovereign independent country, not being part of China. I think from the Chinese perspective, such violation of the one China policy is a direct infringement of China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and this does not generate any goodwill among the Chinese people towards the US government or towards those US politicians. And I think this is the main reason why, for example, China all of a sudden walked away from several major things of cooperation between China and the United States, including, for example, China-US discussions and negotiations and cooperations on climate change. Because I think from the Chinese perspective, if you treat me as a partner, let's deal with each other as partner. If you violate my fundamental interests of sovereignty and territorial integrity, then you cannot expect that I will cooperate with you equitably on many other important things. So I think it really depends on the real attitude of the United States, how to deal with China as a friendly country, as a partner, as a country you can get along with despite of all the differences, or, for example, you want to keep violating on China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The ball is in the court of the United States.
Right. And in the lead up to the 20th CPC National Congress, China's diplomat Wang Yi was visiting the U.S. and he was warming up perhaps for this meeting between the two leaders. So what were some of the key messages from Foreign Minister Wang to the U.S. side?
Yeah, actually this time the ball is on the U.S. side. Actually, as we have witnessed in recent years, the United States just initiated a very not so rational policy toward China, for example, the trade war and also the strategic competition with China. The reason is very simple. How can the United States, get a good result from such a competition? Because of the multipolarization of international politics and also globalization of world economy. And of course, I don't think the United States can get the support from ASEAN countries, even from Japan, from South Korea. They, I'm sure, are not 100% in favor of such a policy to isolate China from the international community. How can the United States do that in that way? The United States cannot make it. So I think this time the U.S. should change a little bit its mind, its mentality, to think about it's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources to initiate such a so-called strategic competition with China, or to return the direction to the cooperation with China.
So the two leaders are meeting now as we speak. It's also interesting to see how the host country, Indonesia, is trying to put together this meeting and to coordinate things to facilitate the dialogue between the two leaders. Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries have been accustomed to this changing relationship, changing dynamics in the relationship between China and the U.S. I want to get your thoughts on this, Professor.
Well, first of all, I think all of us need to give credit to Indonesia government and the Indonesian president for steering a very steady course in hosting this G20 summit, despite of all the pressures from certain countries to demand that Indonesia do several other things, for example, which are not directly related to G20. And secondly, I think Indonesia, as a very important, as the largest ASEAN member state, do have a vested interest in seeing that the relations between China and the United States are normalized and constructive, rather than, for example, antagonistic and conflicts against each other. In this regard, I think both China and the United States need to demonstrate to important countries like Indonesia and other ASEAN countries and other G20 member states that they do want to maintain stability in the bilateral relations, not only for China and for the United States, but for the global community. I would say there can be no sustainable growth or recovery if China and the United States do not get onto the same page. And there can be no real growth for the stronger world if China and the United States really get out of their relations with each other and they get on an antagonistic path against each other. So I think the two leaders really need to think about not only their own country, but also the two countries as a whole, as well as the international community as a whole. This is truly a global relationship of the highest stakes possible.
Yeah, the geopolitical impact from the relationship between China and the U.S. will be far and wide. How will countries, for example, Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries, benefit from a better China-U.S. relation?
Yeah, as the leader of Singapore mentioned once upon a time, that they do not like to see the competition in ASEAN countries because they all said they don't like to see two big elephants fight against each other in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia will suffer a lot from such a competition or confrontation, even conflict between the two major powers in that region. So I think the regional countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, they all would like to see the cooperation. Of course, the competition is there. Because the two large, world economies and two large international powers in the world, there should be some competitions. But this is only one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, we should cooperate. We should think about the future of the two countries and to think about the future of the region and the international community.
And talking about the relationship between China and ASEAN countries, I want to mention the BRI, China proposed Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, we've seen massive projects going on in Southeast Asian countries in terms of infrastructure and business investment in different countries. So this major diplomacy outreach, how has it brought growth opportunities for countries?
Well, first of all, China has worked with Laos to build its railway from Yunnan all the way to Vientiane. And now China is in the middle of finishing up this high-speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung in Indonesia. Now, these are just examples of how China's cooperation with ASEAN member states can really generate huge benefits for the ASEAN countries. In a sense, ASEAN is very fragmented in terms of, for example, religious faiths, languages, for example, background, and also the sizes, development, etc. And also, in terms of connectivity, it is not very well connected. And from the Chinese perspective, if we can really cooperate with them...
Professor Gao, we are now seeing some pictures of the meeting between the leaders of China and the United States. Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden are meeting in Bali, Indonesia, on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. And this is, of course, a very important meeting as it is the first time
as the heads of states of two big countries of China and the U.S., we must take a good leadership for our bilateral relationship. We must find the right direction for our future relations. We must help to boost the bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. Politicians must think thoroughly about not only the development direction of our own countries, but also our relationship with the other countries in the world. We tend to assume that now we are all wrapped up in such a transformative era, and human community is confronted with unprecedented challenges. The world is now standing at an intersection. So where is the way out? The whole world is concerned about it. Our meeting this time is also drawing wide attention from this world. Therefore, we should work together with the rest of the world to deliver hope to the world and confidence to the world, stability, and inject more dynamism into the international development. In today's meeting, I stand ready to talk candidly with my counterpart about some strategic issues. Just as always, I also look forward to work together with Mr. President Joe Biden of the U.S. to walk towards the pathway of sound development of our bilateral relationships.
So President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden are meeting there in Bali on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. And one important question in President Xi's speech just now, he mentioned what is the way out of the perhaps troubled relationship between China and the U.S.? What is the way out for the two countries to work out a more united front in many world issues?
Absolutely. I think President Xi Jinping also mentioned the importance of figuring out a way to boost bilateral relations rather than pushing it further down. This is very important. You know for sure that President Xi Jinping and President Biden actually were old friends or old acquaintances. They met with each other on many occasions. They traveled together, they wined and dined together. They talked about serious business for China and the United States. So I hope they will refresh their acquaintances over the past decade or so, and then also realize that whatever they are doing right now in Bali is not only important for China and the United States, but exactly as President Xi Jinping mentioned, it has global bearing for mankind. So if they do the right thing, everyone benefits. If they, for example, make a wrong decision one way or another, by one side or another, then mankind suffers. This is the high-stake meeting, probably the highest stake we can think about in the world of today.
Of course, building a community of shared future for mankind, and this, of course, highly significant for not only the development between China and the U.S., but also, as we mentioned just now, the ASEAN bloc as well as European countries. They are very significant in those regards. What are some of the easier channels of cooperation that you could see that China and the U.S. could work on to build on their past achievements and perhaps expand their cooperation in more fields?
Yeah, number one, I also again to say again is the mentality. Just because of the so-called strategic competition initiated by the United States, the U.S. would like to get some bloc, military bloc, economic bloc to isolate China and to confront China at this moment. So this is the number one job. We should have a new mentality. We should change our mind to the lessons from history. Actually, the United States, at least in recent 5 years, has got nothing just by such a strategy. I mean, the so-called strategic competition between the two countries. It's a lot of waste of time and resources by the United States. So China, as you mentioned, this is the shared future. This is the shared world. We would like to share our achievements with our neighboring countries, with some other countries. For example, we contribute greatly to the fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic. We gave a lot of logistic support to our neighboring countries and to developing countries, including the stuff like the mask and some other, stuff for the developing countries. So I think we should have a shared mind. We should have a shared world, a shared future, so the two countries can go together to recover together, to recover strongly at this moment, not only in economy, but also in the peace and stability and for the future of the two countries and the whole international community.
Yeah, of course, major power relations will always have their ups and downs, and we've seen some good moments. But the problem is that how could the two leaders of the two countries use their wisdom and perhaps political will to make sure that that these good moments last, and they really could translate their visions into action and to keep these actions consistent?
Well, first of all, I think the two leaders also need to realize that between China and the United States, not only the two largest economies in the world, but also two countries with very strong military background, war is not and should not be an option. So if there are any decision makers in Washington who really think about using war as an instrument to solve whatever problems between China and the United States, they are either out of their mind or out of their sanity, or, for example, doing something against the fundamental interests of the American people, as well as against the Chinese people. Therefore, there are differences between China and the United States, unavoidably, but what to do with these differences? The only way viable is to get along with each other, to peacefully talk about these differences and try to minimize the differences and maximize their common ground. Now, in this regard, if the United States really want to tame inflation in the United States, China can help. If the United States is really interested in boosting its infrastructure investment, China can help. If the United States is really interested in containing the risk of a major financial crisis, China can help. China can help the United States on many, many things, and this will generate benefits for the United States as well as for China. And if the United States and China get along with each other, the whole world benefits. So I think this is one way to see how, for example, China-US relations can be managed for all these benefits. But the other side of the story is that if, for example, confrontation is chosen as the path forward, then it may lead to confrontation, conflict, or even war. And then everyone will become a loser. The United States will become a loser, China will be a loser, mankind will be a loser. What's the fun of losing everything we have while we can really maximize the benefit for all of us?
Well, Chinese President Xi Jinping used to say that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for two big boats to sail together. So the relationship between China and the U.S. does not have to be confrontational. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And then when it comes to diplomacy, there are principles and there are flexibilities. What are some of the areas that China would like to make a compromise, for example, lending a helping hand in some areas of the U.S.'s development?
Actually, we have a lot of areas for cooperation between China and the United States. For example, the fighting against COVID-19. I think just because of the lacking of cooperation in this area, actually the United States has suffered a lot. About 1 million people died in this pandemic, and about 80 million people suffered such COVID-19 disease. So this is actually a very poor cooperation and between the two countries. So if we think about the fighting against Ebola in 2014 in Africa, I think at that time the United States and China did have a good cooperation, and the reason is very simple. If we control the disease of the COVID-19, we can save the other continents from such a disease. So this is the very simple logic for the two countries to cooperate, and also we can maintain peace and stability, and also non-proliferation, and the fighting against the terrorism in the world. These are the common challenge, and also climate change. These are very important challenge for the international community. How can we deal with such a common challenge in the future? Not only to think about you are going to take my position, to take my place as the big boss of the world. No, I don't think that's a good idea for the United States to take such a so-called strategic competition strategy with China.
And of course, leaders will have to use all their political will and wisdom to refresh the relationship between the two countries. All right, gentlemen, now let's take a look at this. Let's move our eyes back to Indonesia a little bit. China and Indonesia's railway project is seeing positive progress. The 150-kilometer rail project is expected to ease challenges for commuters and completely modernize Indonesia's transportation industry. CGTN's Sukina Aluwalia reports.
Indonesia is preparing to unveil Southeast Asia's first high-speed railway. The project is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It will connect Jakarta with West Java's most populated city, Bandung.
Most important project between Indonesia and China, and as the largest foreign investment in Indonesia history, this project is this three-stage position. So this time the G20 meeting, Indonesia said is the chairman. We have to do the showcase about our project to show the cooperation between Indonesia and China, to show the faster development of Indonesia society.
The project is expected to accelerate both social and economic growth in the country. This project will completely transform Indonesia's transportation industry. Hundreds of people commute between Jakarta and Bandung each and every day. Usually it would take around 2.5 hours by car, but with this train it would take just around 45 minutes. A monumental progress for millions of people that have to brave Jakarta's traffic daily.
I think the development or the construction of the high-speed railway is not only to bring the benefit to the people, to the transportation sector, but also give the benefit to the, such example, for the Indonesian railway development, and then for the aspect of technology, and then also for the economic point of view. And this operation of the high-speed railway Jakarta-Bandung in next year, hopefully in next year, is the significant and important milestone for the development of the railways in Indonesia.
The high-speed train is targeted to start early operations in June 2023. Sulkina Aluwalia, CGTN, Bandung.
The lingering pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and climate change have pushed world crises to unprecedented levels. Now, as leaders of major economies gather for the G20 Summit, they are at a critical crossroads to tackle a looming recession and grave energy and food crises. Gao Yiming has more on this.
The world economy is slowing sharply, teetering on the brink of recession, with many countries seeing their highest inflation rates in decades. The International Monetary Fund forecasts global growth to drop from 6% in 2021 to a little over 3% this year, with predictions for next year even worse. This is the third weakest performance in 2 decades, after only the 2008 financial crisis and the worst times of the COVID-19 pandemic. To tackle soaring inflation, the U.S. Federal Reserve has ordered some of the most aggressive interest rate hikes in decades, announcing a 75 basis point jump for 4 consecutive months. This has led central banks around the world to follow suit and prop up their currencies against the dollar. Interest rates have been increased 3 times in the European Union, 6 times in Canada, and 7 times in Australia this year. The UN Conference on Trade and Development says policies in advanced economies could push the world toward a global recession and stagnation, with developing nations taking a heavy toll.
So if interest rates, real interest rates, go up in the U.S. and people start pulling their money out of the emerging markets, bringing it back into the U.S., then their currencies are going to depreciate, the dollar will appreciate. That'll make it more difficult for the companies in these emerging markets to repay these dollar-denominated debts.
Amid a looming recession, the world faces a cost of living crisis, especially for energy and food. World energy markets began to tighten in 2021 due to fast pandemic economic recovery efforts and climate shocks. The situation escalated after conflict erupted in February between Ukraine and Russia, the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels. Russian gas exports to Europe have fallen over 80% in 1 year, following U.S. and EU sanctions on Moscow. This has sent energy prices to record highs and triggered concerns over winter storage.
No gas means no hot water, no heating. We have to keep her wrapped up with her thick blanket just to try and keep her from not having a face cold and stuff.
The chief of the International Energy Agency says the world is in the middle of the first truly global energy crisis, with a depth and complexity that has never been seen before. The IEA says developing nations are the most vulnerable to soaring energy prices. Those include oil-importing nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Running high with the energy costs are food prices and a hungry population. Extreme weather, regional conflicts, and COVID-19 have already led to rising food insecurity over the last 3 years. The breakout of the Russia-Ukraine conflict has exacerbated the problem, as the two nations provide nearly 30% of the world's wheat supply. A staggering 345 million people now face acute food insecurity, up from 282 million at the start of this year. Soaring prices have prompted crop-producing countries to impose export restrictions. In the most vulnerable countries, the food import bill has increased by over $25 billion compared to last year, affecting 1.7 billion people. Multiple alarm bells are ringing as world leaders gather for the G20 Summit. Coordinated efforts and swift action are called to address the root causes of the crisis, each more devastating than the last. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
Meanwhile, officials and businessmen from Indonesia have also expressed their expectations for Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Indonesia.
Most of the leaders of the G20 will come and participate at the summit in Bali. Of course, as ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia in China, we are looking forward to the visit of President Xi Jinping. And then Bali is beautiful. So please do come, welcome to Indonesia and to Bali.
I think the Chinese has been a very strong partner of Indonesia, both in trade and investment, and we're hoping especially during this, of course this is a multilateral platform, but we are also taking the opportunity, the momentum to enhance our bilateral cooperation. The world now is facing unprecedented situation. It's important that in the recovery of together, we are focusing on the collaboration aspect. The theme on the B20 is advancing innovation, inclusion, and collaboration. So I think this is really 3 areas that's very important where the China can play a role.
As the host country of this year's G20 Summit, China Media Group spoke with Indonesian President Joko Widodo about his expectations for the Leaders' Summit.
Indonesia hosts the rotating presidency of G20 this year, and very soon in November is going to host heads of states and government summit here in this beautiful island of Bali. So we just wonder, how's the preparation going and what issues would top the agenda?
Iya, G20 adalah grup negara-negara besar yang juga punya.
The G20 is a group of major world powers. It has enormous influence. We are together facing many problems now. The crisis must be overcome, and the global economy must recover as soon as possible. We must be well prepared. So the G20 Summit must produce concrete results, complete practical tasks, and have a real impact on the world. We should avoid empty talks and instead focus on cooperation to create a better future. The current financial crisis, energy crisis, and the food crisis are intertwined, and we should deal with them together, not alone. The G20 has the power to influence future development.
Well, since the inception of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, China has proposed 2 more major initiatives over the past 2 years. They are the Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative. Let's now take a closer look at these 2.
In the report to the 20th National Congress of the CPC, which concluded last month, Xi Jinping said only when all countries pursue the cause of common good, live in harmony, and engage in cooperation for mutual benefit will there be sustained prosperity and guaranteed security. That explains why China puts forward 2 initiatives, the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. Let's start with the Global Development Initiative, or GDI, which was proposed by President Xi Jinping in a virtual address to the UN General Assembly in September 2021. It responds to the worldwide setbacks caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Aiming to build a global community of development, the GDI puts development first and people at the center, and seeks to accelerate the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The initiative is also committed to bridging the global North and South gap and eradicating inequality between countries. The initiative has 6 principles: a people-centered approach, development as a priority, benefits for all, innovation-driven development, harmony with nature, and action-oriented approaches. China is pushing for the translation of the initiative from concept to reality, with concrete results from cooperation projects in 8 key areas: poverty reduction, food security, COVID-19 vaccines, financing for development, climate change, as well as green development, industrialization, the digital economy, and connectivity. The GDI has been warmly received by the international community since its inception. More than 100 countries and international organizations have voiced their support for the initiative, and over 60 of them have joined the Group of Friends of the GDI, launched by China at the UN in January 2022. Months after the GDI proposal, Chinese President Xi Jinping put forward the Global Security Initiative, or the GSI, at the opening ceremony of the Broad Forum. The GSI answered questions like what security philosophy the world needs and how countries can achieve universal security. The initiative is highly relevant as it aims to meet the pressing needs of the international community to maintain world peace and safeguard true multilateralism. The initiative is underpinned by 6 commitments: staying committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, taking seriously the legitimate security concerns of all countries, peacefully resolving differences and disputes between countries through dialogues and consultation, and maintaining security in both traditional and non-traditional domains. It charts the course for all countries around the world to find a path that ensures security for all, by all, and of all. China stands ready to work with all peace-loving countries and peoples to carry out the Global Security Initiative, nurture security dynamics, featuring equality, justice, joint contribution, and shared benefits, and forge a strong synergy to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Despite global challenges, China also stands ready to work with the international community to put these 2 initiatives into action in a bid for an even brighter future for humanity. Wang Qianhui, CGTN.
The Chinese naval hospital ship Peace Ark has arrived in Indonesia on a humanitarian mission to provide free medical services to local people. Our reporter Huang Yue has the story.
The Peace Ark set sail again. Upon arriving in Jakarta, medical workers set up tents in the harbor and started treating patients.
My mother has a heart disease, so I brought her here. She's been under treatment for a long time, but we haven't seen any progress. My friend told me a Chinese hospital ship would come, so we came here for treatment. I heard that a Chinese hospital ship came in 2013 and treated a lot of people. I hope they can help my mom.
I'm Mrs. Eunice and I'm 60 years old. My family drove 100 kilometers from our home yesterday to attend the welcome ceremony. The medical team told me they started work today, so I came to the cardiology department. I'm grateful to them for helping us.
This is Mission Harmony 2022, Peace Ark's 10th humanitarian mission since 2008. At the invitation of the Indonesian military, the hospital ship will stay in Indonesia for 7 days. Over 100 Chinese medical workers are on board, with 14 clinical departments and a pharmacy, as well as a helicopter for emergency medical use. The Chinese Navy earlier said surgical treatment and hospitalization will also be offered if necessary. Over 700 local residents came to see the doctors on the first day. Local people say they are impressed by the professional and thoughtful services.
I've never been to China. I got all the information about China from social media before today. But this time, I saw firsthand what Chinese people and China's medical services are like.
The Peace Ark has sailed 240,000 miles over the past 14 years, serving more than 230,000 people in over 40 countries and regions. Huang Yue, CGTN.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden. He arrived in Bali in the last few hours to attend the G20 Leaders Summit. And this is his first overseas trip since the conclusion of the 20th CPC National Congress. The meeting also marks the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders since Biden took office. And now let's get some final remarks from our guests on this very important meeting. So, Professor Gao, we don't know the details of the discussion between the two leaders, but what are your expectations that perhaps the two leaders could agree on?
First of all, they need to build a floor to the bilateral relations. They need to set up guardrails so that the relations do not get out of control. And then, to the extent possible, they need to talk about possible cooperation projects. And there are so many things that China and the United States can cooperate for mutual benefit. And I think whatever eventually they decide to disclose to the world will be of tremendous amount of importance for all the countries involved. ASEAN countries, you name it, other G20 member states, all the European member states, for example, all the African countries, all the emerging markets, you name it. Because right now in the world of today, nothing is more important as China-US relations. And right now, President Xi Jinping of China and President Biden of the United States have a lot of stake on their shoulder. And I think they need to deal with this summit meeting very carefully, very prudently, and I hope they make the right decision for all of us.
Yeah, a great deal of complexity and uncertainty going on in the world. How could this meeting, Mr. Tang, boost confidence from other countries in their journey forward?
Yeah, I think number one is a new consensus will be there for the two countries and for the international community, and also new guidelines will be established by the two leaders for the future of the two countries and for the future of the world. Of course, actually, the two countries have already learned the lessons from the recent history, especially the recent so-called competition initiated by the United States. There should be some changes in the future for their policy toward each other and toward international community.
All right, thank you so much for your analysis, for sitting with us throughout this very important meeting, Mr. Ting Jianqun and Professor Victor Gao. Appreciate it. And that's going to do it for our special coverage of the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden. Thanks for watching.